Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I'm a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, any of his other books. And we have a lot to get through. Actually, we don't have that much to get through. I only chose 13 questions this time, but some of them are a little bit more involved and I have to go into more detail. That's why I didn't choose as many as I normally do. But for a little light reading, how about The Hobbit, right? How about The Hobbit? And I'm going to read a bit of inside information, which is the chapter where Bilbo actually talks to Smaug the dragon. Well, thief, I smell you, and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along, help yourself again, there is plenty and to spare. But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. No thank you, O Smaug the Tremendous, he replied. I did not come for presents. I only wished to have a look at you and see if you were truly as great as tales say. I did not believe them. Do you now? Said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. Truly songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities, replied Bilbo. You have nice manners for a thief and a liar, said the dragon. You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you and where do you come from, may I ask? You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led. And through the air, I am he that walks unseen. So I can well believe, said Smaug, but that is hardly your usual name. I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number. Lovely title, sneered the dragon. But lucky numbers don't always come off. I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I came from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me. Those don't sound so creditable, scoffed Smaug. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer. And I am barrel rider, went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. That's better, said Smaug. But don't let your imagination run away with you. This, of course, is the way to talk to dragons if you don't want to reveal your proper name, which is wise, and don't want to infuriate them by a flat refusal, which is also very wise. No dragon can resist the fascination of riddling talk and wasting time trying to understand it. There was a lot here which Smaug did not understand at all, though I expect you do, since you know all about Bilbo's adventures to which he was referring. But he thought he understood enough, and he chuckled in his wicked inside. I thought so last night, he smiled to himself. Lake men, some nasty scheme of those miserable tub-trading lake men, or I'm a lizard. I haven't been down that way for an age, but I will soon alter that. Very well, O barrel rider, he said aloud. Maybe Barrel was your pony's name, and maybe not, though it was fat enough. You may walk unseen, but you did not walk all the way. Let me tell you I ate 6 ponies last night, and I shall catch and eat all the others before long. In return for the excellent meal, I will give you one piece of advice for your good. Don't have more to do with dwarves than you can help. Dwarves, said Bilbo in pretended surprise. Don't talk to me, said Smaug. I know the smell and taste of dwarf, no one better. Don't tell me that I can eat a dwarf-ridden pony and not know it. You'll come to a bad end if you go with such friends, thief barrel rider. I don't mind if you go back and tell them so from me. But he did not tell Bilbo that there was one smell he could not make out at all, Hobbit smell. It was quite outside his experience and puzzled him mightily. I suppose you got a fair price for that cup last night, he went on. Come now, did you? Nothing at all? Well, that's just like them. And I suppose they're skulking outside, and your job is to do all the dangerous work. And get what you can when I'm not looking for them, and you will get a fair share? Don't you believe it? If you get off alive, you'll be so lucky. Well, that's where I'll stop, because I could just read The Hobbit all day to you, but I can't. I would totally do just videos of me reading the Tolkien books, but you run into copyright issues at that point. But anyway, let's get to your questions. Like I said, we do have 13 questions to get through. It's not as many as I normally put in a video, but a few of these, not all of them, but a few of these I do have to go into a bit of a greater detail. So, and this first one is along those lines. And let's see, this one was sent to me by John Lundbeck, who asked, for all Silmarillion aficionados, what is the relationship between the music made by the Ainur and events in Middle-earth and Aman and Valinor? Did the music foretell and precede the ages, or unfold contemporaneously with them? Elaboration appreciated. The music, whether it was the themes of Ilúvatar sang by the Valar, or the opposing discordant themes of Melkor, are the story of creation from the beginning to the end. But only one has seen the end. The Ainur all come to sing to Ilúvatar by ones and in small groups, but not all at once. So the Ainulindale was the first such gathering of all of them, and they were led in the music by the themes of Ilúvatar, though Melkor came up with his own themes. Ea, the created world, the world with a capital W, the universe created by Ilúvatar, is the physical manifestation of the music. But before the creation, a vision was shown to the Ainur. I'm going to read you a selected passage from the Silmarillion. But when they come into the void, Ilúvatar said to them, behold your music, and he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing, and they saw a new world made visible before them, and it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. And when the Ainur had gazed for a while and were silent, Ilúvatar said again, behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you, all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added. And thou, Melkor, will discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and will perceive that they are but a part of the whole, and tributary to its glory. So the history of the created world played out in this vision, including the machinations of Melkor. However, this end was not shown. I'm going to move on to another passage here. But even as Ulmo spoke, and while the Ainur were yet again gazing upon this vision, it was taken away and hidden from their sight. And it seemed to them in that moment that they perceived a new thing, darkness, which they had not known before except in thought. But they had become enamored of the beauty of the vision, and engrossed in the unfolding of the world which came there into being, and their minds were filled with it, for the history was incomplete, and the circles of time not full wrought within the vision was taken away. And some have said that the vision ceased ere the fulfillment of the dominion of men and the fading of the firstborn, wherefore, though the music is over all, the Valar have not seen as with a sight for later ages or the ending of the world. So, though the music was wrought by the Ainur, they did not know every detail. And the later parts of the history of Ea were more veiled from their sight. But the music does contain every bit of creation from start to finish. It is essentially the story of the world. And this does include things that the Valar themselves wrought, unknown in their own mind. One such example is the Ents, the shepherds of the trees. They were created in the music by Yavanna, though she did not necessarily remember doing that or realize what she was doing at the time. It was pointed out to her later by Manwë. And even in the Timeless Void, her thought came to the protection of her children, the trees, that in the music the shepherds were created. So, though the music was performed by the Ainur, it was Ilúvatar that not only gave it form and reality, but who wrote the themes and the history, including how it all ends. So I hope that's what you were looking for. Okay, next question, and this is my favorite sort of question. They don't always do like the biggest numbers on Quora, but my favorite sort of questions have to do with the linguistics of Tolkien's world, especially that Tolkien himself was a linguist, so his languages are very, very well thought out. So this is the question: what is the meaning of Aragorn's sword name Anduril in The Lord of the Rings? So, according to Aragorn, it means flame of the west, but as in all of Tolkien's linguistics, that is a poetic translation. It's not a literal translation of Anduril. The sword was originally called Narsil when it was wielded by Aragorn's ancestor Elendil, which comes from the Quenya Nar, which means fire, and Thil, which means white light. So the Thil suffix is especially interesting. It usually refers to celestial bodies, such as Ithil is the moon, which is indeed where the meaning Minas Ithil comes from, Tower of the Moon, and the name Isildur, which means servant of the moon. So basically, Narsil translates literally to fiery white light, but the poetic application is red and white flame. And in letter 347, Tolkien extrapolates that the full poetic application of Narsil is chief heavenly lights as enemies of darkness. So Aragorn states that Anduril means flame of the west, and he is being equally poetic as his ancestors were. It is derived from the Quenya word Adune, which can be applied several different ways, including that it means the west, but it is referring mostly to the sunset, the evening, when the sun sets, which of course the sun sets in the west. The other portion is Ril, which means glitter. So in a sense, the west that Aragorn is referring to is Numenor, which translates literally to Westerness or Westland. Interestingly, Numenor was also referred to as Andor, which means the land of gift, as it was indeed a gift to the Edain, and the similarities between Andor and Andune and Anduril are hardly coincidental. So the quite literal translation of Anduril is glittering sunset. But understanding that the sun sets in the west, Numenor was in the west, and the brilliant glittering of a sunset is like a flame, we can see how Aragorn gets Anduril. This is a much better way than literally translating the words flame and west into Quenya, which would be mashing together Runya and Numen. Tolkien was careful that his languages didn't only make sense, but they had to sound nice. They had to be fair to speak. So coming up with something like Runyamen or something, it wouldn't sound good, but Anduril sounds really good. Hey, excellent question. I always like the linguistic questions. Okay, so this next one comes from the Oski Bosky, who asks, what if the One Ring was dropped in space? Since this area is safe from being destroyed by the Valar, would they find it and destroy it in space? Okay. Wow. Well, this depends on what you mean by space, but either way, it's a bad idea for everyone except Sauron. First, it needs to be said, Sauron does not necessarily need the One Ring. In the Third Age, he wants the One Ring, but he doesn't need it. In the Third Age, he's doing a marvelous job of taking over the world, or at least Middle-earth, without the One Ring. He does want the One Ring once he's discovered that it's not only still intact, but has been found. Getting the One Ring would help him a lot, but he doesn't actually need it. Throwing the ring into space. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this actually entails. It's not that different from the idea of chucking the One Ring into the sea. Gandalf shot down that idea of throwing it into the Sundering Sea because eventually it'll be found and it will trouble the world once more. Gandalf's feeling was that we cannot put off the disposition of the One Ring to a later generation. It is in the hands of good and we must destroy it now. So the One Ring was not the key to Sauron's victory, but it could be the key to his defeat, and it did wind up being the key to his defeat. By destroying it, a large part of Sauron himself will be gone permanently. His power will be just lessened to a very drastic point. This leaves him, as Tolkien put it, brought low, to the point that he cannot return in power. Chucking it into space is not destroying it. It would only let Sauron take over Middle-earth, basically unopposed. Now, as for what space entails in the world of Tolkien, there is Arda, which is the world. And there is Ea, which is the world, with a capital W. That's the created world, the universe. The Silmarillion hints that there are other worlds and domains within Ea, but Arda, the planet and the surrounding area, would certainly contain a bit of what you might call space, Ilmaren, which means that if anybody had the ability to get the ring into space, which they don't, perhaps Arundel would, but he's not about to do that, it would eventually just come back down and be found. If you're talking about thrusting the ring into what you might say is outer space, beyond Arda, into the void, it may find its way into, well, let's start with not the void. Let's say beyond the Ilmaren, right? Beyond the gravitational pull of the planet, outer space. It may find its way to one of those other worlds, or it could just float forever, and it would be lost, unfound. Sauron wins. Nobody destroyed his ring. Anyone who found it, if it did wind up on another world, and there were people there, they wouldn't know what it is. They wouldn't know what it represents, and they wouldn't know that it should be destroyed. If it is thrust beyond Ea, into the void, which would mean that Arundel is really asleep at the switch, because he's guarding the doors of night, and somehow they got beyond him and beyond the doors of night and thrust the ring out into the timeless void. It's possible that it could float forever, which, as I said, is bad. It's possible that it may come to Iluvatar, and he might destroy it, but it's also possible that it could come to Melkor, and that would be really bad. So the Valar are bound to Arda. They are the powers that give Arda life. So they cannot leave it until the end of the world. They no longer technically reside on the planet itself, but they're still connected to it. Aemon is in Ilmaren. It's connected to the planet by a thin strip of sea that the elves can sail on. Arundel can tolerate Ilmaren because he has a Silmaril with him, but and he could travel between Aemon and Middle-earth and the Doors of Night on his ship. He would be the only one that would find the ring out there, or that could put it out there, but he wouldn't touch it. He's smarter than that. It would just be a bad idea. Destroying it was the only answer. Okay, next question here. This is another one that's pretty involved, and it also came from the same person, actually, from the Oski Boski, who asks, were the Valar even aware of where the One Ring is in the Third Age? No. They may have foresaw that it would be rediscovered in sort of a roundabout way. I'm going to talk a lot about a specific character in this, because it's very important to talk about the wisdom of the Valar and the foresight of the Valar. The One Ring was lost in the Gladden in the year 2 of the Third Age. And some believed it to be lost forever. But regardless of this, Sauron would eventually regain his physical form and proclaim himself. The last time that he had proclaimed himself was around the time that the One Ring was forged. And the response from the Valar was to send Alatar, Palando, and Glorfindel to Middle-earth. Later still, they knew Sauron would recover and start up his nonsense again, so they sent Olorin and Curumo and Iwendel to Middle-earth. Olorin is the central figure here. He has made connections with every major race. They called him all sorts of names, Mithrandir, Gandalf, all sorts of things. It was he who was the most concerned with Sauron's dealings, while the other two that came with him, they explored their own avenues. Gandalf was considered the wisest of all the Maiar, and his gift of foresight is nothing short of incredible. Shortly after the War of the Ring ended, he told Frodo, Gimli, and Legolas that out of all the deeds that he did in Middle-earth, the most important and the most difficult deed was convincing Thorin the Second Oakenshield, to take Bilbo Baggins on his quest. Gandalf wasn't even sure why it was so important, why he felt it in every fiber of him that Thorin must take Bilbo with him. But we came to see why this was so monumentally important. Bilbo became the ring finder. Unsaid by Gandalf, but still obvious in the text as being incredibly difficult and incredibly important, is another job where Gandalf must convince someone to do something that they really don't want to do and that is sort of against their nature. It's now 61 years later, and he has to convince Bilbo to give up the ring and give it to Frodo. At this point, Gandalf had deep suspicions about the nature of the magic ring that Bilbo found. And although Saruman had convinced him that the One Ring was lost forever when he first brought up the idea that it might be found, Gandalf worried greatly on the ring and its effect on Bilbo, though perhaps Gandalf had at one point convinced himself that it was a lesser ring. Seeing the power that it exerted over Bilbo convinced him that it was at the very least a ring of power, and seeing Bilbo have this strong attachment to it and his unwillingness to give it up made him suspect more than ever that the One Ring had been found. This was hugely important, as Frodo would become the ring bearer, who would deliver the ring to Sammath Naur. Now, Gandalf also busied himself greatly with the capture of Gollum. He enlisted Aragorn for help once it was beyond his ability to find the creature. His discovery of Gollum's nature, his previous capture by the enemy, and his information shared, this was all incredibly important stuff to Gandalf. He was very concerned with all of this. As well, Gandalf knew that it was wise to keep Gollum safe and alive, unharmed, because Gollum would later become the Ring Destroyer. So we can see that through the machinations of the wisest of all the Maiar, that the Ring Finder left his house and saw the wider world, the Ring Bearer came into the One Ring, and the Ring Destroyer was alive and able to play his part in the end that Gandalf knew that he must. All of this is the incredible gift of foresight. And we can thank the Valar and their own foresight. They knew to send Olorin specifically to Middle-earth, along with Tarandor, Ravendil, Palasendo, Hymenar, and under the leadership of Melian. Sending these 6 was important, as the 5 Guardians would become the later Istari, and Melian was important to send because her union with Elil Thingol would lead to the creation of Doriath and the birth of Luthien, which would start a lineage that goes all the way down to Aragorn. Olorin, in his journey, loved the elves. He walked among them, unseen, hidden as one of them. He gave them fair visions and greater wisdom. He made the elves better. He made the elves more like him. They knew to send Olorin a second time, to the annoyance of Tarandor, or Kurumo, as he was also known. And while many Maiar were spirits of a single Vala, Olorin learned from many. But the most important, I think, was Nienna, because Nienna taught him the virtues of patience and mercy, which we can also see his great patience with Thorin, his great patience with Bilbo, his mercy with Gollum. The Valar did not know specifically where the ring was. Or if they did, they would have imparted this knowledge directly into one of their agents. They could have told Glorfindel where it was, for example. But in imparting Olorin with the specific lessons that he needed and sending specifically him at that time, they set in motion the events that led to the ring's discovery and destruction. Gandalf's incredibly important role as Gandalf the Grey was recognized immediately by Círdan when he arrived, who imparted him the Red Ring, and by Ilúvatar, who returned him from bodily death as Gandalf the White. So you could see that they may not have known exactly where it was, but their foresight is what led to the destruction of the One Ring. Even before the One Ring was created, Nienna knew on some level that it was very important to teach Olorin patience and mercy. Okay. Next question. Does Galadriel hold a will of adamant that Gandalf mentions to resist corruption in the contest over a Palantir with Sauron? So essentially what you're asking is, could Galadriel do what Aragorn did and wrest control of the Palantir from Sauron? it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what will Galadriel had. She wouldn't touch a Palantir. If you remember, the gift that Galadriel gave to Frodo was the Phial of Galadriel. It was a glass container, and within it was starlight, the starlight of the Arundel. And she gave it to Frodo, and it was greatly important later on because it helped him ward off Shelob, and it gave him light where there was darkness. Samwise, when they're at Cirith Ungol, or at least the pass of Cirith Ungol, he realized that the nature of the light in the container makes the phial sort of a pseudo-Silmaril, made of the same light of the trees that Feanor had enshrined into Selima, only she just enshrined it into glass. The light is sort of secondhand. It's from the Silmaril, which was put into the glass as the light of the Silmaril was put into the two trees. Samwise, at this point, he wonders, wow, we're in the same story that Beren was in. Do these stories ever end? Now, what does this have to do with the Palantir, you might ask? Well, Galadriel created something like a Silmaril. It wasn't exactly a Silmaril. It wasn't made out of Selima, but it was something like a Silmaril. And she went about it in a completely different way than Feanor, who was her uncle, did. And she did something that he could never conceive of. She gave it away. For Galadriel, light was to share, not to hoard. The Feanorians were not that different from the lustful light seeker Melkor, and they committed horrible atrocities. Before this, even Galadriel saw the mind of Feanor much as Varda saw the mind of Melkor, and she wanted nothing to do with him or of his craft. She wouldn't give him her hair, for example. So if Gandalf is correct, and he always is, that Feanor created the Palantiri, Galadriel wouldn't even want to be seen in a room with a Palantir, much less touch one or use one. Her will was not the will to dominate the Palantir. Her will was the will to reject the Palantir, to not be interested in it at all. Okay. Next question. This one's a quick one. How did Frodo survive the ring's destruction? Well, Frodo was not bound to the One Ring. He did not perish in its destruction like the Nazgul did, because the Nazgul were bound to the one. He did, however, suffer. He suffered great damage on an emotional and a spiritual level. Frodo had not destroyed the One Ring. He had failed, in quotes, failed, in the sense that he could not bring himself to throw it into the fire at Samath Naur. This is not a poor judgment of Frodo as a character, but how could anyone resist such a thing in such a place? But where Frodo triumphed was getting the ring where it needed to be and exercising, I'm coming back to the talk about Gandalf, exercising the two virtues taught to Gandalf by Nienna, patience and mercy. These virtues are the key to victory, for it was Frodo's patience and his mercy that destroyed the ring. A less patient or less merciful sort would not have allowed Gollum to live. Frodo even forgives Gollum after Gollum dies, even after the final betrayal and the maiming of his finger, he forgave him. Frodo was not destroyed, but a part of him was, in a sense, he did not get closure. The ring had become precious to him, just as it had to Gollum and just as it had to Bilbo. And losing it in a violent conflict damaged him, just as losing it damaged Gollum. Thankfully, by the grace of Gandalf and the elves and the Valar, Frodo would be healed of his physical, his psychological, and his spiritual ailments in the West. Okay, next question. I like this one. Did Melkor have any romantic relationships with any of the Valar or the Maiar? Well, he tried to. He tried. Melkor is quite interesting. He spends much of his time casting down light, but he's also intensely attracted to light. I kind of mentioned this earlier. I said Melkor, light seeker. One could make the argument that were Melkor to never fall, he may have been the Lord of Light. As Melkor as a light seeker starts out early. The first mention of him in the Silmaril is that he's out there searching for the secret fire, the flame imperishable, the light of creation, which he cannot find in the void, because it lies within Ilúvatar. He also was intensely attracted to Varda, And she was associated with light. After all, she is the creator of the stars. So Varda, she shut that down pretty quick. His advances were not welcome. Even in this early stage, before the fall, she could see his dark thoughts, and she wanted nothing to do with him. Instead, she married his brother, Manwe. So I have to mention some stuff that's not necessarily canon, but it's interesting to talk about. In some other earlier versions of the story, Melkor was also attracted to a Maya named Arien, who was a spirit of fire that he failed to conscript. Essentially, she is a good Balrog. Arien was no more interested in Melkor's advances than Vardo was, and rejected him. And in this early tale, which is no longer canon, but it's interesting to talk about because it could be, it makes sense, Melkor attempted to take her by force, and she burned him. And that's what turned him ashen and pale and gray. But and one more I want to mention is Luthien. Luthien is not a Vala or a Maya, but in the Silmarillion, Melkor, who at this point was called Morgoth, was very lustful of Luthien. She was the daughter of a Maya, and Luthien took advantage of his lustful gaze as she danced for him, putting his court under a spell and into a deep sleep, which allowed her to attack him more directly and put him to sleep. She knocked him out, which let Beren gain one of the Silmarils. So Melkor tried it with the Mother of the Stars, and in an early version, he tried it with the Bearer of the Sun. He really likes the hot ladies. I'm sorry, I'll get my coat. I'm out. All right, next question. So this one came in from Butch Montgomery, who asks, how do the elves communicate with the Undying Lands? How do they know that it was okay to bring the hobbits and the dwarf with them when they left Middle-earth? So in the case of the hobbits, getting the grace to sail west, there was no communication needed with the west. And in the case of Gimli, there appears to have been no communication at all. Though communication across the Sundering Sea is possible, it isn't relevant in either of these cases. The eagles could travel freely up the straight path, and the Master Stone in Eressëa, the main Palantir, may or may not be in contact with Círdan's Palantir in Elostirion, though Tolkien never specified if the Master Stone could contact any of the seven. If it could, the stone in Elostirion seems like the most likely case. Now, in the case of Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam, though Sam's departure was delayed due to him having a new family, Gandalf can, and certainly did authorize this, as was agreed by the elves. Though mortals have been forbidden from sailing to or abiding in the Undying Lands, there have been some exceptions here and there, such as Eärendil and Elwing. They defied the law and sailed west with no permission, but they were pardoned due to the fact that they were half-elf. And they were made immortal. They were mortal before that, but they had to choose whether they would be mortal or immortal, and they chose immortal. Tuor similarly sailed west, and the elvish legend has it that he was also made immortal, despite being an Adan with no elvish heritage. In the case of Tuor, though Tolkien stated it was by the grace of Ilúvatar that he was given immortality, no specific permission was given by the Valar prior to his departure. But he did travel with his elvish wife, Idril, and quite possibly with his good friend, Voranwa. So it does seem that elves can bend the rules for their mortal friends in some extreme circumstances, which would account for Legolas making a unilateral decision to not only sail west, but to bring Gimli with him. And it should be mentioned that Legolas bypassed the usual route going through Mithlond, the Grey Havens. Instead, he departed from Belfalas in the south, showing that Sindar elves with no particular connection to the Undying Lands could find the straight path on their own, without the need of Círdan's assistance. So it seems it was likely that Legolas called an audible for Gimli, and as the dwarf was near the end of his life, he was 262 years old at the time, he did not care what happened to him. He would be going to the Halls of Awaiting very soon either way. So in the case of the hobbits, Gandalf had more than enough authority, being not only the chief representative of the Valar in Middle-earth, but also the chief representative of Ilúvatar himself. Okay, next question. This one came in from Adrian Boots. I like this question. How was Aulë able to create dwarves if Melkor, Morgoth, was only able to twist and interbreed existing living things. So this is interesting. I'm going to take a sip of water here. I have a bit to say about this. This is why I chose less questions, because there's a lot that I have a lot to say about. So in the early writings, Melkor created plenty of things. Orcs, dragons, trolls, and such. But the word create started to stick in Tolkien's craw after a while. Tolkien decided that evil cannot create anything new or anything fair. So the easy answer is that Aulë is not evil, so he could create something new. However, there is, of course, a bit more to it than that. There was also the limitation that only Ilúvatar could create beings with true life, meaning that anything created by the Valar was either not sentient or had no free will. So we see exceptions all over the place. The eagles of Manwë, the Ents of Yavanna, but these were created in the Ainulindalë, not later on. So they had Ilúvatar's stamp of approval, as it were. Melkor could create things in mockery of Ilúvatar's children, and he made twisted versions of other beings. The trolls were theorized by Treebeard to have been in mockery of the Ents, and the orcs were either derived of elves or they were made in mockery of elves, but this doesn't account for dragons, vampires, and werewolves. So we see in writings that dragons have sentience, they have will, the ability of speech and reasoning and free will. We see the same of werewolves and the later wargs, and we don't really know much about the vampires. They're lesser known, but it was one of Sauron's favored forms, so we could assume that there was some degree of sentience there as well. Melkor, and Sauron as well, get around this with necromancy. They cannot create new life that has free will, but they can manipulate souls of their captives and transplant them into bodies made in mockery of creation, or in the case of dragons, seemingly an extension of Melkor's will, as the first dragon Glaurung gazed with Melkor's gaze and spoke with Melkor's voice. Once a breeding population exists, you have created something new, if not something fair. These creatures were all seen as abominations, of course, but this is how the Dark Lords managed to bend the rules. So, Aulë went about things in a drastically different way. He did not make the dwarves in mockery, nor did he employ necromancy to give them will. They didn't have any will. They only did what he willed them to do, and they stood idle when his mind was elsewhere. It was not in his power or his authority to create the dwarves, and he didn't take evil means to get past that point. And when Ilúvatar asked him, "Why did you do this?" he appealed to the question by saying that he meant no mockery. He apologized, and he merely wished to indulge in the urge to create that Ilúvatar had instilled him with, and that he had grown impatient, waiting for the awakening of the elves and the awakening of men. Because he wanted creatures to inhabit Middle-earth, speaking creatures. Now, once Ilúvatar saw that Aulë's intentions were noble, he did impart free will into the dwarves, who flinched and cried for mercy when Aulë, in his repentance, went to strike them down. So, in summary, Melkor and Sauron can create these things because they use evil methods to break the rules, while Aulë took a sort of different route, ask for forgiveness, not permission, and he received both. Okay, next question. This one's a quick one. How did Saruman get to Middle-earth? Did he just appear there, or did he come from Valinor like Gandalf and Radagast? If so, why didn't he return with Gandalf at the end of the Third Age? Like with all the wizards, he came on a ship. The arrival of the wizards was witnessed by Círdan the mariner at the Grey Havens, and they came over ships from the west. And this is where Círdan surrendered the Red Ring to the Grey Messenger, who later took the name Gandalf. Tolkien later wrote that not all of the wizards arrived at the same time. The Blue Wizards arrived earlier, along with Glorfindel, with Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast arriving later. Círdan called Saruman the White Messenger, and he described him as raven-haired with a fair voice. Why didn't Saruman go back? He was dead. He was killed by Grima Wormtongue, and in that scene, his spirit rises from his body and looks to the west and is denied, is blown away by a cold wind out of the west. So he basically did try to return at that moment, and Manwë was basically like, no, you're no longer welcome here. You are banned. Okay. All right, next question. This one's also a quick one. Do elves have beards? If not, why are they shown with beards in the Lord of the Rings movies? Elves don't have beards, generally speaking. There are some exceptions. None of the elves in the films had beards, so I don't know what you're talking about there. Even Círdan, who was supposed to have a beard, at least at the end of the film, he appeared in 2 scenes, at the very beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring and the very end of the Return of the King, and he should have had a beard in the second scene. He did not, so they didn't even give Círdan a beard, and he was supposed to have one. There are exceptions to the whole elves don't have beards thing. There was Gwyndor, who was partially faded and unnaturally aged by Morgoth. There was Matan, the information on him being buried within, from the Shibboleth of Feanor, from Parma Eldalambrion. But no particular reason was given why Matan would have a beard. Círdan had a beard because he was very, very old, and he was also likely partially faded due to his advanced age and having stayed in Middle-earth for too long, exposed to the taint of Melkor. So there was a time when Tolkien had entertained the thought that the example of Círdan was that elves would eventually, after many, many thousands of years, enter a third stage of life, and they could appear old and have beards, but he did abandon that. Okay. Next question. Did the Hobbits ever live in Arnor or Gondor? Well, yes. The Shire is in Arnor. It's a region of Arnor specifically called Arthedain. Arnor had been split into 3 different realms, and one of them was Arthedain. The king of Arthedain gave the Bree Hobbits permission to settle in the land that would later be called the Shire. They also, of course, lived in Bree and all over Eriador, which is almost the same thing as Arnor. As for Gondor, generally speaking, hobbits didn't really live in Gondor. They were considered practically mythical there, but later on, after the War of the Ring, Merry and Pippin spent the last few years of their lives in Gondor, so they did live in Gondor. They were even buried next to Aragorn after he died. Okay, last question, and this one's also one that I have a lot to say about. And this is actually the one from... I didn't realize that this is the one from the thumbnail. I don't usually save the one for the thumbnail till the very end. This was sort of coincidental. So, what was the exact size of the Balrog that Gandalf fought? What would be its height if you were to scale it to today's measurements? So, it's difficult to interpret the exact size of a Balrog for a few reasons, but it's not entirely impossible. So in this case, I want to sort of show you 2 pictures. So can I do this? Okay, so this is a picture of a Balrog. You could see Gandalf there, and there's Durun's Bane, and it's just gigantic. It's massive. It's way too big. It's a very cool picture. I like it a lot. I like the art. I like the way it's done. It's very cool, but it's not accurate at all. The Balrog is towering over Gandalf, and it appears that the Balrog, we're not seeing all of him. He's like crouched down or something. He's almost crawling because we could see his head and part of his shoulder. Where's the rest of his body? He must be huge. He must be massive. Now, we must remember, the bridge of Khazad-dûm was very narrow, and it was designed to be very narrow because the idea was to bottleneck potential invaders. The Balrog had to stand on this very narrow bridge. There is no way he was that big. So I'm going to show you another picture here. Oh, that's the same one. Hold on. There we are. So this is almost the same scene. It's done by different artists, but you could see Gandalf here, and you could see Durun's Bane here. And this is a very, very, very different take on a Balrog. Extremely different. And this is actually the more accurate, at least, take on a Balrog. It's not as grandiose. It's not as epic. but it is more in line with what Tolkien actually wrote about Balrogs. It is difficult to discern their actual size because it was difficult to discern their shape. They were vague and shadowy with an aura of flame and an aura of shadow, and it was difficult to see where they ended and their aura began. Now, this being said, Tolkien described Balrogs as being about double the height of a man or an elf. And in The Fall of Gondolin, when Glorfindel is fighting a Balrog, he stabs it in the stomach, because that's where he could reach. In this very close-up battle, they were grappling. The actual size of a Balrog is obfuscated by the wings argument. We have to talk about this. Balrogs did not have wings, but Tolkien's use of a mixed metaphor gave rise to the belief that they did. They could not fly, they could not glide, they could not hover. They were always running, leaping, climbing. As incarnated Maiar fire spirits, they would not have vestigial wings. They wouldn't have useless wings. What would be the point of having them? Let's talk about something that I spoke a little bit about earlier, the good Balrog counterpart, Arien, the fire spirit that was not corrupted, that did not join Melkor. She didn't have wings, though actually she could fly. She bears the sun across the sky. But because she was tasked with doing that by the Valar, they probably gave her the ability to fly, just like they gave Elwing, Eärendil's wife, the ability to fly. And she may have been given wings by the Valar, just as they gave wings to Elwing. But Melkor, especially, would not give wings that were not functional. So let's go back to Balrogs. The wings idea comes from the Balrog's behavior after Gandalf makes his speech. He says important things in the speech, and the most relevant to this discussion is wielder of the flame of Arnor. He is saying he is the wielder of the sun itself. Arnor means the sun. So, and of course with the sun, we have another reference to Arien, the fire spirit who carries the sun, who resisted Melkor's evil influence and did not become a Balrog. So in this case, Gandalf is essentially boasting, you are a spirit of flame, but my flame is greater. Now, what happens right after this? The flames surrounding the Balrog dies down, but the aura of shadow spreads out like wings. That was the exact phrase used. Meaning that the Balrog doesn't have wings, but there's a simile used to describe the aura spreading like wings. The simile became a mixed metaphor a little bit later when it says the Balrog's wings spread to seemingly fill the chamber, meaning that the aura had grown very large indeed, making the Balrog seem much larger than it actually is. In this case, it becomes a mixed metaphor because it starts with a simile using like wings. That's what a simile is. It's a comparative statement that uses like or as. But as it has been established that the Balrog does not have literal wings, but as a comparative statement, Tolkien can now switch over to a metaphor to just call the aura wings explicitly without causing confusion. He failed miserably in that sense because it did cause a lot of confusion, and people are still arguing about it to this day and debating whether or not Balrogs have wings. So, regardless of all of that, Balrogs could puff themselves up to appear much larger than they actually were, but their actual height, about 10 to 14 feet tall. And they were man-shaped, meaning they were humanoid. They didn't have horns or tails or spikes. They looked like a very large man made out of flame and shadow, just twice as large. So if you look at the range of heights that a man or an elf can be, you just double that, and then you have the range of heights that a Balrog could be. So anyway, guys, that has been the video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed it greatly myself, and if you got all the way to this point, you had to have enjoyed it, right? You didn't watch 49 minutes of me talking and hated it? That would be weird. So click the like button, subscribe if you haven't, share the video around. I'm sure you know other people who are into Tolkien. And send me some questions. Of course, there's a link in the description to my Quora account. That is the way to ask me a question that would be featured in a video. Of course, if you have a question you just want to ask in the comments, you can do that. I try to respond to comments as much as I can. We'll see you guys next time.